All right, ready? Let's talk about the brain. So remember, the brain is well protected. So we covered this in a previous lesson, but let's review. So it's protected with bone, the cranium. It's protected with meninges. Remember those three layers, the dura mater, that tough outer coating, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And then remember there's a space in between, which is filled with CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid. That fluid providing some cushioning. So if we're like shaking our head like this, or we fall or we get hit, it does help to provide some protection. And then the blood-brain barrier, which does give us the least permeable capillaries in our body, and assuming everything works correctly, provides some additional protection for the brain. Now let's look at the brain in more detail. So it weighs about 3 pounds. It has white matter and gray matter. So what's the difference? Well, you can tell from this picture, when you're looking at the surface of the brain, we're looking at gray matter. The white matter is a little deeper. So that contains the actual axons. It's covered with myelin, right? The fat, so that's what gives it that white color. It's our deeper brain tissue. It connects gray matter to gray matter, or gray matter to the body. So the white matter is fatty, and it provides connections between gray and the body, or gray to gray. So then what is gray matter? Well, if white matter was the axons, gray matter is the somas and the dendrites. So it actually does the processing. And this is the superficial brain tissue. It's called the cortex. And it's involved in our muscle control, our sensory perception. This is really where the work is done. Now you may wonder why the folds. So interesting, look at that mouse brain without the folds. So during fetal development, our gray matter is expanding. And to relieve that pressure, okay, like it's expanding too much, it's like swelling, 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 it starts to fold. So these folds allow humans and a lot of other animals to pack in more neurons. So this means more advanced brain with increased cognitive abilities. So there are 3 main parts of the brain. What are they? Well, the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum. So let's look at each in order. So we have brainstem. So what's the brainstem? Well, it connects the brain to the spinal cord, and it has 3 major parts. So we have the midbrain. That's the superior part. It's associated with vision and hearing, so senses, and also some temperature regulation. And then we have below, or inferior to the midbrain, we have the pons. And the pons, again, is that middle part. It's associated with sleep and balance and eye movement and facial expressions. And then we have the midbrain, we have the pons, and then inferior to the pons, we have the medulla oblongata, sometimes just called the medulla. So it is the inferior part. It's associated with our most basic life functions like breathing and heart rhythm and blood pressure, and also things that help to keep us alive, like swallowing and vomiting. So the parts of the brainstem, again, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Next is cerebellum. Cerebellum is little brain. It hangs like a bell below the cerebrum. It's responsible for things like coordination, balance, our sense of body position, motor learning, posture. Okay, all of those things work together to help us be balanced and coordinated. Then we have the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It's divided into 2 hemispheres. There's a corpus callosum present and 4 lobes. So let's look at the cerebrum in more detail. So there are two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. Now there's something called lateralization. So what that means is the two hemispheres are not identical, and each hemisphere has functional specifications. So what happens is the right side of our body is typically controlled by the left side of our brain, and the left side of our body is typically controlled by the right side of our brain. Okay, and some things tend to be found on the left side and some things tend to be found on the right side. But this is not as straightforward as people once thought it was. So lateralization is not 100%. So it's not as cut and dry as people used to think that it was. And if you're right-handed, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean you're left brain dominant, and so on. Okay, so there are a lot of misconceptions about left brain versus right brain, and it's not 100%. So say, for example, on the left side, that has to do with like mathematics and with language. That doesn't mean that your right brain is not involved in that process at all, okay? But again, those things tend to be processed on that side, okay? But again, it's not 100%. But there are two best examples of lateralization where things are processed in a specific area, and if that area is damaged, that ability is lost. And one is Broca's area. Broca's area is responsible for speech. It's part of your frontal lobe, and it's only in your left hemisphere. So it doesn't have a matching area on the right hemisphere. It is in that area of the frontal lobe, left hemisphere only. The other one is Wernicke's area, and Wernicke's area, found in the temporal lobe, is responsible for language comprehension, so understanding. So not just understanding the words, but like understanding what it means. And that, again, is found only in the left hemisphere. So there's not a corresponding Wernicke's area in the right hemisphere. It is solely in that area. So how do these two hemispheres communicate? Well, there is something called the corpus callosum. It is C-shaped. It is like this thick bundle of white matter. Remember, that's the axons, and it connects your two hemispheres. Okay, the corpus callosum can be cut in a process called the corpus callosotomy. Okay, so that means cutting part of the corpus callosum, and it's used to treat epilepsy. But this is not just a random thing because it's literally open brain surgery. Okay, so it's only going to be for severe seizures. It's only going to be when anti-seizure medications really didn't help. So this is not going to stop seizures, but what will happen is it will often keep a seizure from affecting only one hemisphere of the brain and therefore be less severe. So this is not like a cure, and someone will still need to stay on anti-seizure medications, but it can help in those severe situations. Now, before modern times, when they were using the corpus callosotomy to treat epilepsy, they cut the whole thing. Now they realize probably not the best thing because we kind of do need information crossing both sides of our brain, so they will cut only a portion of the corpus callosum now. But split brain experiments were done with patients who had that complete corpus callosotomy. Okay, and it did give us a lot of insight into the brain, showing that vision on the right side of your body connected to the left hemisphere and vision from the left side connected to the right hemisphere. There was a lot of lateralization in terms of which side of the body is controlled by which hemisphere of the brain. And it did provide insights into what the left hemisphere is better at. Remember, lateralization is not 100%, but the left hemisphere is better at analytics, better at verbal, better at speaking. And the right hemisphere is better at our space perception, so where we are in space, at music, at reading maps and giving maps and directions, but also in applying emotional context to language. So our left hemisphere might be able to literally read the word that says rainbow, but the right hemisphere is going to be able to what does that mean? Does that mean something to me? And supply that emotional context. All right, so when are the left and right brain in conflict? Because sometimes it's not just this great partnership. So there's something called the Stroop Effect. So our left brain is fantastic at reading, and our right brain, remember, is great at context. So let's look at the picture of the animal. So when our left brain looks at that, it reads the word cat. Our right brain is interpreting the picture, and those two things don't match up. So our left brain is trying to say cat, it says cat, and our right brain is like, oh my goodness, that's an elephant. So there's a conflict. Also, when we're trying to read a word. So in this case, I want to say the color, but our left brain is like, that word says green, okay? In condition B, our right brain is like, but the color is red. But our left brain is like, but the word says green. But our right brain is like, but the color is red. Okay, so they can be in conflict. They can also be in conflict with optical illusions. So what you see, what you interpret, is sometimes a crisscross between our right brain trying to look at the big picture and our left brain being real analytical. So each hemisphere of the cerebrum has 4 lobes. So technically it's 8, right? It's the right frontal, the left frontal, okay? So there are 4 lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. And each hemisphere has its own portion. So right frontal, right temporal, right parietal, right occipital, left occipital. So the temporal lobe. Okay, I think it's kind of close to your temples. It's right here above your ears. So the important thing to remember about temporal lobe is it's associated with hearing and auditory processing. And that's where Wernicke's area is found. So language comprehension, hearing and interpreting. So a hint for this is tempo is sound. So temporal, sound, hearing. Occipital lobe. So that's in the back. Ever hit your head like in the back here and people say you see stars? Well, the reason is the occipital lobe is responsible for vision. So it's our visual cortex. A hint to remember this is occipital is like binoculars. It's vision. Parietal lobe. Okay, so this is somatosensory. So what does that mean? Well, it's proprioception, like where we are in space. It's pain, pressure, position. So it's a bunch of P's. Okay, so it's like interpreting our sensory information. So pain, pressure, but it's also where we are in space, our position. Okay, understanding that about our body. So P is parietal, proprioception, pain, pressure, position. And then we have the frontal lobe. So that's Broca's area. That was speech, remember? It's also where we have mental action and physical action. So mental action are executive functioning. So it's things that give us like our personality and allow us to analyze and reason. And then physical action, like deciding to move, okay? So a hint is the front is like the motor, okay? So it decides. So it's that thought process, but it's also the movement associated with it. And there you have it. That's the brain. Oh my goodness, there's so much more that I could say, and I love this topic, but I do hope you learned something new.